So we're about to take a journey back to ancient Crete, to the birthplace of one of history's most famous monsters. But here's a thought. What if the maze built to imprison the Minotaur wasn't just a myth? Today, we're exploring the incredible Palace of Knossos, a real place where the line between legend and history gets very, very blurry.
Just think about that question for a second. We all know the story, right? A monstrous beast, a brave hero, and a maze that's impossible to escape. But what if the heart of that legend, the labyrinth itself, wasn't just some made-up scary story? What if it was inspired by a place that actually existed?
And what a story it is! You've got all the classic elements. A powerful and vengeful King Minos, a terrifying half-man, half-bull monster, and of course, a maze so complex that the genius inventor Daedalus designed it to be inescapable. It's a foundational thriller of Western culture. But that's just the legend.
And this is where we take a sharp turn from fantasy into fact. The legend gives us this picture of a dark, terrifying dungeon for a monster. But archaeology? Well, it reveals something totally different. A bright, sprawling, and unbelievably sophisticated palace that was the beating heart of a vibrant civilization.
So let's put the myth on the shelf for a moment and dive into the real-world archaeology. We're heading to the real Knossos, the actual palace on the island of Crete, where this whole legendary story probably got its start.
And here it is. This wasn't just some ruin. The Palace of Knossos was the absolute crown jewel of a truly remarkable Bronze Age society. Honestly, when you look at its sheer scale and complexity, you can totally see how the myth of the labyrinth was born.
Now, a palace this grand and this complex doesn't just pop up out of nowhere. It was the work of some brilliant and still kind of mysterious master builders. So it's time we meet the people who actually created Knossos.
We call them the Minoans. And here's a fantastic little piece of historical irony for you. Modern archaeologists actually named this entire civilization after the legendary King Minos from the myth. So in a way, the legend helped give a name back to the very people history had forgotten. How cool is that?
The Minoans weren't just artists. They were absolute engineering geniuses. The fact that any part of Knossos is still standing today is all the proof you need. So let's take a look at their blueprint for how to build a palace that could survive the very earth shaking beneath it.
You see, Crete is in a really active seismic zone. The Minoans knew this, and they didn't just cross their fingers and hope for the best. They innovated. They actually developed an ingenious secret weapon to protect their grand palace from being turned into a pile of rubble by earthquakes. Their method was a two-part marvel of engineering. First, they laid down these massive, solid stone foundations for a rock-solid base. But the real genius was in the upper walls. They built them with a timber framework inside the stone. This made the walls flexible, so they could actually sway and absorb the shock of an earthquake instead of just shattering. It's an absolutely incredible feat.
And on top of being strong, Knossos was beautiful. It's famous for these unique red columns that are actually wider at the top and get narrower at the bottom, a total Minoan signature. They also designed these massive light wells, kind of like ancient skylights, to funnel sunlight deep into the palace's core. And they covered the walls in vibrant paintings, or frescoes, showing everything from dolphins to grand ceremonies.
But the brilliant design and the beautiful art, they only tell part of the story. Because Knossos wasn't just a home for royalty. Its vast, multi-story, room-filled layout shows us that it was something much, much bigger. It was essentially a city all by itself. Yeah, think of it less like a castle and more like a capitol building, a central bank, and a cathedral all rolled into one massive complex. It was the absolute nerve center for the entire Minoan civilization. And the breakdown of how the palace was used is just fascinating. The royal apartments were just one small piece of the puzzle. Huge amounts of space were dedicated to ceremonial rooms, religious sanctuaries, workshops for artisans, and of course, administration. It's this sprawling, multi-purpose complexity that likely made later Greeks look at it and think, wow, this place is a labyrinth.
If you want to really understand its economic power, you just have to look at the storerooms. Archaeologists found rows and rows of these enormous clay jars called pithoi. They held vast quantities of olive oil and wine, the lifeblood of the Minoan economy. This was their central treasury and distribution center all in one.
So, you've got this incredibly wealthy, powerful central palace, but something is missing. Something that every other major power in the Bronze Age had. Knossos had no defensive walls. It was completely unfortified, totally open to the sea. And you have to ask, why?
So what does it mean to build your most important building with no walls?
Well, a civilization only does that when it feels completely secure, totally untouchable. The lack of fortifications tells us that the Minoans weren't afraid of a land invasion. Their true defense, their real wall, was a mighty navy that controlled the seas around them. This was a palace built without fear, and it tells a story of absolute confidence and incredible power.